Why did you decide to visit all of these schools?
Honestly, to my experience, I think there are fewer progressive schools in the north.
So जो ये skill वाला gap है, that seems to be a big gap to even hire.
Teaching is a performing art. It's no longer just teaching.
Are there in hiring in some schools? Have you seen some interesting practices?
One of the attributes they look at is also health, and not just physical health, but your mental health as well.
So a couple of teachers that I spoke to in Bangalore, this was a little shocking for me. A bunch of teachers wanted to move out.
I mean, teaching as a profession is right at the bottom where teachers are not given that level of respect.
What do you see teachers and schools do with parents in general?
I keep on hearing from multiple school owners that it's very difficult to now manage the expectations of parents.
What is the career trajectory for a teacher?
When you join, there is almost a 70-80% possibility of you just stagnating or you rotating across different subjects and classes with some increment in your salary, etc.
Wow, this is interesting. I don't know how many schools do this. So the audience of the channel of Staff Room are mostly young teachers, say less than about 30-35 years of age, and new principals, people who have just either taken over from their parents who would have started schools, or they have recently gotten promoted to principal. That's the main audience. The intent of the conversation is try and bring out best practices of schools that are really doing well, from teacher professional development, teacher well-being, teacher support, teacher growth, and so on, and showcase that, so that one, on the teacher side, they are able to pick and choose which schools that they want to join and grow their careers with, and for other schools as well to exchange essentially best practices and try and implement them. Now, the intention of getting you is one, you're associate director at Om Foundation. So there's a bunch of things that you guys are doing, and also your experience of having studied almost 10-12 schools, visited them, and recorded all of these best practices. So the hope is that through this conversation, we are able to share all of that with the principals and teachers, and they can hopefully execute some of these things.
Yeah.
So, पहले तो let's start off with why did you decide to visit all of these schools, and where all did you go? How did you travel? Which schools were these?
Yeah. So actually, about last year, I started my journey in the field of education, and I think it wasn't directly K-12 that I started with. It started with a lot of different solutions, primarily focused around well-being of children. That was the anchor. But slowly, I moved from solution to solution. So I started with, let's say, toys as the get-to-go solution, whether if they can kind of solve well-being for children, especially at a foundational early age. But figured through multiple conversations and discussions that probably you need something more experiential, hands-on. And so pivoted from there to say, can we design an after-school program? Because if it has to be scalable, it has to be kind of asset light in that way. But then with after school programs also, what came as a roadblock or a bottleneck was the duration of the program itself. So you require to really work on well-being, you require more longer term engagement with the child, and so an after school program might not do justice to the overall outcome. So then from there I pivoted to a preschool, and from there to a proper K-12 school. Now the journey of a K-12 school was completely new to me because I come from a very generalistic consulting kind of a background with a degree in commerce and management. So that essentially, without having any experience in education, then I started looking at different schools that are working in the field of education, K-12 essentially. And that is where I started looking at all of these 10-12 schools that I visited in the last 1.5 years, primarily with the intent to learn from them as to what are the good practices that they are currently, let's say, implementing in their school, and what are some of those practices that I can kind of imbibe as I start my own journey in the K-12 space.
What all states were these spread across?
These were primarily spread across, I would say, all the 4 regions. So I covered in the north. I covered. So honestly, to my experience, I think there are fewer progressive schools in the north because of the parent profile and the preferences here. But some of them included, for example, Prakriti in Noida. Then I visited. There's a Waldorf school called Aram in South Delhi, and then there's Muni International, which is again a progressive school here in Delhi. So visited three of them in Delhi, NCR essentially. Then visited some of them in Ahmedabad. Ahmedabad actually I found to be a hub of a lot of progressive schools coming up there. So Eklavya uh, there, then Riverside, then MGIS, Mahatma Gandhi International School there. Then visited Pune where there is DLRC, the Learning Farm. And then you have Ikea schools in Bangalore, which I didn't visit physically, but I learned from their practice. There's a lot of content available online. And then finally, I visited Shanti Niketan in the east, which is also kind of a hub
This
for
is the
especially
same
creative.
Rabindranath Tagore wala Shantiniketan. Got it.
Yes.
Got it. Well, any learning on why Ahmedabad is a hub of these progressive schools?
That's a very interesting question. I've actually not looked at it that ways, but what occurs to me is number one, I think the parent expectations there are slightly different from what you would find in a typical north region of the country. So they're slightly more open to different kinds of experiments, or let's say a more progressive, non fully academic oriented curriculum, which is easier to therefore implement. Also, the quality of teachers that you generally get, uh, I think they're slightly above average. So again, to execute those kind of progressive practices also becomes easier. Again, all of this is very anecdotal because of whatever conversations I had, but that's my understanding.
Got it. Got it.
In fact, just to add, I plotted all of the progressive schools that I came across on a map of India, and most of them happen to be in the west or south region of the country. My understanding is that that's because of these two reasons that I articulated.
One additional thing I think is also income and GDP. West and South is significantly higher per capita income compared to North and East. North में भी फिर भी
Yeah.
ठीक है,
Hmm.
Delhi NCR हरियाणा पंजाब वगैरह है,
Hmm.
but East particularly उतना higher GDP नहीं है, per capita income नहीं है. So I
Hmm.
think then that makes sense. Let's start with the first thing, because you also said the availability of quality of teachers is a big thing.
Yeah.
What are some hiring practices that these schools, progressive schools you have observed, do? How do they
Hmm.
hire talent?
Yeah, very interesting question. In fact, the time I started looking at school as what I wanted to do long term is when I spoke to one of my relatives who's already set up a school in the eastern part of the country, somewhere around Jharkhand. And the first pain point he mentioned, which is why he's now thinking of shutting down the school, is the quality of teachers that are available, or the non-availability of teachers largely. So that's obviously a very big problem, and schools that have solved for it are probably going to be there for the longer term. Some of the key parameters on which these schools assess, two of them actually stand out, and the others are more hygiene. One of them, which is a commonality across progressive schools, I've observed, and may not be there in the general traditional schools actually, is the fact that they look at the teachers' warmth or inclination to really work with children. So the ability to kind of be happy around children or work with children, so that they can establish a rapport and a connection with children. That's something that a lot of progressive schools like Eklavya or Riverside, for example, look at that as a key parameter even before assessing other attributes, because when that happens, you're able to build a good relationship with the child, and learning is potentially a byproduct in that process. But that's the first thing that they look at, and can be again checked through demo classes, just general temperament during the interview, through more situational questions, etc. But that's the supreme kind of parameter.
What kind of questions are asked in an interview to assess this? In a demo class, it's more easy to assess because you're
Yeah.
seeing what the teacher is doing. How do you check for this in interview?
In an interview, you can ask them very situational questions around class management, for example. So let's say if a child is behaviorally not, let's say, as per the norm of the class or as per class discipline, whatever, they're not behaving in that manner. How do you tackle that child? How do you address that child, especially when other children are looking at you also in that moment? So how do teachers respond in that moment is what tells you a lot about the teacher's uh, temperament,
Hmm.
largely in a class. For example, one way to react at a class, let's say you're teaching a lesson and the entire class is very very distracted. One way to look at that is you will basically increase your volume and ask everyone to be like, uh, class, stay silent and listen to what I'm saying. The other way around it is, why is the class distracted? Let me figure that out first. Maybe my content is not interesting enough. So in fact, one of the schools I visited, Riverside, the founder over there, Kiran B. Sethi, she mentioned a very good phrase which I now that stays with me, is that teaching is a professional art. Sorry, teaching is a performing art. Teaching is a performing art. It's no longer just teaching; it's a performing art. So if you're not interesting enough, you will not find students to be interested in you. uh, so that's the reason why I feel that level of rapport and bonding with children is more critical and important than just knowing the content or the domain that you're, let's say, going to be teaching.
Got it. Now, this is a very tricky situation from a school point of view.
Yeah.
Overall, while I was just researching for this, one thing that I found was just about 30 to 40% of D.Ed and B.Ed students pass the teacher eligibility test, right? And even in that, hardly 1.5% actually score more than 70% marks. So जो
Interesting.
ये skill वाला gap है, that
Hmm.
seems to be a big gap to even higher. So your starting point as a school is always a certain level, and then you have to work upwards.
I would differ there a little bit. So, first of all, B.Ed or D.Ed doesn't give you that basic level of hygiene in terms of just competency, whether you will be able to handle the class, etc., or not. Because so many, in fact, B.Ed is typically a backup profession. People don't pursue B.Ed very actively. So, a lot of the teachers in progressive schools actually may not have B.Ed to begin with. So, I think that's my understanding, is that a lot of these international boards, IGCSE, IB, do not require you to have B.Ed as a criteria, entry criteria, whereas CBSE and ICSE and all of the national boards do. And so that becomes a blocker for the traditional schools to hire teachers who may not come from traditional B.Ed backgrounds. Whereas these other schools, progressive ones, they don't look at B.Ed as the criteria. They look at this one factor that I mentioned, which is your interest in working with children, rapport with children, and the other, they will look at domain competency, which can come from your experience, work experience, for example, for that matter. Uh, and you may not necessarily have a B.Ed. So if it is a requirement, you can still parallelly pursue it through IGNU or any other open learning platform or board, but it's not a entry barrier, so to say.
The primary factor that you're talking about is this intention to teach, or rather, how well you're teaching with kids, how well you're working with kids,
Working with children,
working with
yes.
children. Now, what are the other factors that go into it?
The other factors I think are fairly basic. Number one is again domain competency, which we spoke about. That's easier to assess because you can do expert interviews, demo classes, etc. on that particular domain. Beyond that, you also look at cultural fit because, let's say, I work at Home Foundation right now, and we're a non-profit. Now, a very flamboyant teacher who, let's say, has experience in a private setup may not be able to gel well with children coming from a non-profit background, underprivileged background. So that cultural fit is also very important in that sense. And the third thing which we look at is essentially um, health. This is a very interesting thing actually. Riverside, when I visited Riverside, one of the attributes they look at is also health, and not just physical health but your mental health as well, because if you are not well, you will either not show up in school, or you will show up but not be effective in school.
Wow, this is Interesting. I don't know how many schools do this. Now, are there in hiring in some schools, have you seen some interesting practices? Like this Riverside that you mentioned is looking at health as an interesting factor. What are other schools doing that is unique to that school?
One very interesting anecdote that I came across in Eklavya, again, which is another school in Ahmedabad. I don't know why all of these schools are in Ahmedabad only, but is that they ask the teacher for 1 month salary as security deposit.
Okay.
So you have to essentially, if you clear the interview, if you clear the entire recruitment process, you have to, before you join, or let's say in the initial couple of weeks, you have to deposit 1 month salary as security deposit to signal your commitment to the organization.
Okay.
And that's something I've not seen in any other school, but it's a very interesting way to kind of build commitment, especially when one major problem that I've heard, especially in tier one cities, is that teachers keep on kind of moving
Schools.
around. If there's a community or an area where there are a lot of schools in the vicinity, then teachers will keep on switching in between those schools, and primarily for financial reasons. So this actually helps address that.
Okay. Okay. And were you able to speak to the teachers to understand what their point of view was on this?
For the teachers who joined, they were obviously comfortable with it. Initially, it might have come across as a little bit of a surprise, but for teachers who've not joined, obviously, I can't speak to them. So there's a complete bias there in the sample that I've spoken to. So
So, what was that push to join Ekalavya school despite this, let's say, filter or a barrier?
I've not spoken to teachers directly about this, but my sense is that the school has a good reputation that they've built over the years, and that's one reason for that is also the chairman, Professor Sunil Handa, who happens to be a professor at IIM Ahmedabad also, is a person who really grooms teachers once they join. So they have a 2 year, for example, training program in house where they ask teachers to nominate themselves, and whoever nominates goes through a really rigorous journey of 2 years. I mean, they have to really kind of put them selves out there and stay on for longer hours, etc. But that journey makes them a leader in the educational setup. So that kind of mentoring and support that Eklavya provides, I think, helps teachers grow in the long term, and that may not be there in a lot of other schools.
So, one of the things you said was the school has built a reputation and hence
Hmm.
is able to command such a process and a filter as well.
Hmm.
So, when schools look at reputation, they usually look at admissions and reputation in front of parents because that's where the admission comes from.
Hmm.
Now, how does a school even think about, prioritize, and go about building a reputation with the
Hmm.
teachers and teaching community?
Hmm. Got it. No, interesting question. But I think the answer is very straightforward. I mean, it's like any other work setup, it's not different here as well. So, your existing pool of teachers become advocates or influencers once they move out, or in fact, even when they're in school. So, our current pool of teachers, if I had to be honest, at Home Foundation, let me take the example of Home Foundation here. Most of them have been at the school for a long period of time, and that the reason for retention is I think a very good environment that has been cultivated by the director and trustees. Couple of things that stand out in the environment: number one, there's a lot of flexibility given to teachers, especially for different things that may come up in their life journey generally. uh, Second, I think it's a very homely environment where you can it while there is professionalism in the school, it's not like it's a completely casual setup, but there is a lot of homeliness to the environment in the sense that you feel cared for, you feel heard, etc., and you're able to kind of innovate and take risks and still fail and so on. So I think that level of care, support, the ability to have free flowing conversations with the director, with the trustees also for that matter. In fact, one thing that two things that the trustees have done consciously over the last couple of years is that number one, they've ensured that the salaries of teachers are above a certain threshold across the entire faculty. And because we're a non-profit, it's slightly more difficult to do that, to be able to do that. So having all of that put in place and ensuring that happens is one thing that motivates teachers, because ultimately that's also an important factor. The second is just general well-being of teachers. So having well-being as a key focus area by doing things like, one, for example, we have teacher offsites every year, just like you have corporate offsites. So last year, for example, teachers went to gym corporate for two days, and there was no agenda. It was a complete. It was actually offsite as it is defined. Uh, it was There was no agenda at all. It was a completely free flowing setup where teachers could enjoy. They were playing, and trustees were also there. So that also ends up motivating, creates it kind of brings down the barriers or walls when you look at communication between the management and the teacher also.
A couple of teachers that I spoke to in Bangalore. This was a little shocking for me. And this is a fairly prestigious IB or Cambridge school, I think. I forget
Hmm.
whether it was IB or Cambridge, one of them. So paying fairly well, obviously charging a bomb to parents and so on. A bunch of teachers wanted to move out because they
Hmm.
were moving cities and so on and so forth. And the school kept them hanging for their relieving letter for almost 3 4 months.
Hmm.
And it's just a very, and this was not like a one-off teacher. This was a group of some 5 7 teachers who were leaving back to back. There were a bunch of other issues as well, but just this burning of bridges, I think a lot of schools don't think about it like that. How would you structure what these progressive schools are doing for teacher support, and then we can drill down and go point by point uh, on what is specific things they're doing.
Let me address the academic part first. What are the academic things that the school does, whichever schools I've visited, that help the teacher? So I've essentially seen two things that work out academically. One is obviously trainings, which a lot of people talk about trainings, and the second is processes, which is actually less spoken of. So trainings, in terms of trainings, there are different ways in which trainings happen. But one of the interesting things that I saw, which really creates more effectiveness of training, is that some schools have separate training arms under the same banner. So, for example, Mahatma Gandhi International School (MGIS) in Ahmedabad had something called ADEPT. ADEPT is their specific department of teacher training where they train all the in-house faculty. So they go through a four-level program that they've designed in-house. And one of the levels of the program is a spiritual dimension program, which looks at teacher well-being. I mean, how do you activate different levels of the mind from alpha to beta to theta and so on? So that's an interesting way to kind of first say or communicate that we are very like teacher training is an important thing, and we're not just saying it for the sake of it. We actually can show it by building this
And you're
separate
also
institution.
being thoughtful. It's not training for training's purposes,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
NCRT also says you have to have some 50 hours of additional training and whatnot.
Second is, a lot of schools have this, I think is very very critical. So there are a certain number of days that a school is active through the year. Let's assume, let's say it's around 200 for children from 365. So a lot of schools have the same number of working days for teachers, and that becomes a problem because then you have to figure out how to take out time for teacher training in between in that timetable, I mean, which is already very jam packed. So the good schools, what they do is they have extra working days for teachers. Now for teachers it may not come across initially as a thing that they might value, but once they start going through that process, I mean, it's a helpful journey because it helps in the next set of 200 days. So anywhere between 15 to 50, I mean, the range is pretty broad. Extra number of working days are typically carved out, especially for teacher support, not just training, where you do a lot of. So you don't just test cultural fit in the beginning, but you also reaffirm culture every now and then. That's one part of what happens in these extra 15 to 50 days. You also have teacher trainings. You have all the academic planning that needs to happen for the entire year, so that you're not planning on the fly as you. So a lot of this extra time that is dedicatedly carved out for teacher training really helps, and
So,
this I've seen
Nisme, I
every
want
school.
to do a little deep dive on this because this is
Yeah.
something that I've also seen many schools already do.
Okay.
It's become a norm, so to speak, right?
Okay.
That teachers start a few weeks or few days before kids, and teachers end a few days or few weeks after kids,
Mm.
the full academic cycle.
Okay.
Now, what is it that they do in that becomes the quality benchmark,
Hmm.
right? It's one thing to say, okay, आप एक हफ्ता पहले आ जाओ, या you go 1 week later. But what happens in that 1 week? How do you structure that? That seems to be the differential between these progressive schools.
Possibly. I wasn't aware that a lot of schools are doing this because, so yeah, what I think stands out is, for example, if I take the Riverside example, what they do is when they're calling in teachers earlier, they have a couple of principles in mind through which they take that journey. So, number one is aligning teachers on the why of every practice before talking about the how or the what or whatever. That essentially builds a lot of ownership in the teacher to be together in that journey for the next 7 days or 15 days or whatever. So that teachers are actually present mentally and physically both instead of just being there because it's required as a mandatory thing. So that is, I think, very important. That comes as a discussion which is bottom up. It's not something that is presented by the leadership or the principal to the teachers that these are the three reasons why you are present here. It is done as an organic discussion, and that I think helps set the tone for the next set of sessions. Second, what they do well is that it's not just teachers who are present in those 7 days. There's a lot of co-creation that happens. So, for example, if we're planning the academic calendar, we will also have the student reps from school participate in that academic calendar planning. And obviously, you can slot out time for those things separately. But you have the student prefects and other kind of representatives join the teachers in giving their inputs in the planning process. Now, what this does is it reduces the teacher's cognitive load later on when they're in the school during the academic year, because all of the students' feedback and point of view essentially through the representatives is already part of the academic plan.
Like, what are the kind of things the student would share?
For example, if you're talking about sports day, let's say that's an annual event that's happening. A student may share that, ma'am, it's better to do it before Diwali because after Diwali, we're coming back to our exams, and so there's a lot of seriousness that is we're already in that mood or headspace of exams, and having that sports day can be a distraction for us.
Okay.
Similarly, involving parents. So parents typically, especially in tier 1 cities now, I keep on hearing from multiple school owners that it's very difficult to now manage the expectations of parents. That, again, there are multiple reasons for that, but not getting there. So then having parents actually be part of that journey through co-creation, etc., also helps.
No,
So later,
this process is interesting also because it makes real the triangle of teaching. You have the student, you have the teacher, you have the parent. All three
okay,
have to come together for it to for the child to be able to learn well.
absolutely,
And then, of course, there's the school environment on top, which is facilitating all of this. This is not just a talk.
Hmm.
I'm seeing it come real, where everybody is adding value into that triangle, so that that becomes strong. So these were all the trainings, and once a year or twice a year kind of a process.
Yeah,
What are some things that are happening on an ongoing basis through the academic year?
yeah, yeah. Through the academic year, I think multiple other things are happening. If I just look at trainings again, from the point of view of trainings, this I think a lot of schools might do. There is teacher observation that keeps on happening. For example, in private schools, one teacher may request another teacher to observe their class and learn from how they're, let's say, managing children, delivering their class in a more engaging way, uh, etc. Whereas in a school like us, let's say ours, we found that that may not be very effective for teachers, and maybe micro lessons where teachers are delivering that same lesson to a smaller group of teachers. And that's also a way of observation only. You're able to get feedback from your peers. I mean, that's also a way in which your capacity building can happen, but on the go, as the academic calendar continues. Another thing that happens is a lot of external visits and external trainings. So exposure visits, I think, what I typically see in, let's say, at least our school, I would say, is in some cases lack of exposure, where if you're just instead of you coming and delivering a talk in the class, if you're just getting the teacher to go to a certain space and be exposed to what they're doing, there's more reception, there's more inclination to test something like that in their own schools. In fact, just to add to this, one more thing that we've tried to do at our school is see how we can build a culture of innovation at Home Foundation. Because so we have an internal innovation cell, which is an R&D kind of a cell. There are two teachers who look at new programs, so that students can be introduced to. They look at new technologies that teachers can be introduced to, and they also look at new processes that we can introduce in the school overall. So in the process, what we figured was two teachers doing all of the innovation may not be sufficient in the longer run. I mean, they can try a lot of things, but we need a culture of innovation in the school at large to be able to innovate and move up the ladder in terms of the kind of learning that we're providing our children. So there we figured that one way to do that is to recognize teachers for whatever innovations they're doing at a very basic level also. So for example, we pasted a best practices board outside the staff room. We got different teachers to innovate at very, very small levels, and some of those were recognized and pasted on that board. That helped other teachers. It sort of gamified the process where other teachers also got motivated and they started experimenting, and this came in a sort of brought down that you know thought process of you failing and then the management not taking that well,
Hmm.
because all of this was okay. I mean, you can try anything and
Can
everything
you
at.
give some examples of the kind of innovations that you stuck up on the wall?
Yeah. So, for example, Kerala recently introduced that seating arrangement in a U shape
Ah,
in the
ah.
class. If you remember, we thought we'll also do that at Home Foundation. So we tried that, and we also tried group seating. We had benches, so we didn't have that flexibility to do it in a very customized manner. But we tried group seating as well as that U seating. U seating was good, but was not very effective in a lot of different lessons, because essentially it increases the distance, or if the structure of the class is such, you will not be able to fit all children in that U structure. For example, when we looked at group seating again was okay if you were looking at any kind of activity based classes. But if you look at, let's say, maths as a class where everybody has to understand what, let's say, triangles are, or for example what trigonometry would mean, for example, then having them sit in different groups, we saw a lot of behavioral distractions happening in those groups, and second, some of them were sitting not in a perfect angle with the board, so they had to rotate their head constantly, and that became a problem for those students, especially when we had benches and not chairs, which they could have rotated otherwise. So those challenges came up, but irrespective, that teacher tried something new. So we pasted that on the wall. Now we are figuring whether to implement it or not. That's a separate thing.
So we have spoken about a lot of academic related processes, right? Starting before the school, ending after the school, what kind of trainings are happening, what kind of support is being given, and so on. Now, in a school, there's also some administrative work that ends up happening, and that is true for any group of people. You bring 10 people together, start a new company, there'll be some administrative process that will end up happening. Now, is there any support? And if yes, what kind of support happens from an administrative point of view? For instance, data, is there some data review that's happening? Is there sharing of administrative duty that is happening? How does that work out?
I think the first thing is clear allocation of roles and responsibilities, which happens, I would believe, in all schools. Having that clear demarcation of who's going to be doing what helps, and having some sort of a rotation process around it. Um, that is something that we do at our school, and that helps essentially long term, because one person is not burdened with the same responsibility every year. and also everyone's clear as to what is the expectation from them. Second is for their specific roles now that have been allocated to them, how do you help or enable them in that journey? For that, for example, different processes can be set up. For example, one teacher, the library person at our school, she looks at all of the data for the school. So she collates all of the grades data, attendance data, etc. And then earlier she used to also analyze all of that data for us, because we're a donor supported school. So all of that data needs to go to donors. What we've done now is we've tried to create a live dashboard of it, so that all of that data, she's collating right now. So the first step is, instead of her analyzing also that data, or somebody else doing it for her, can we ask her to just upload that raw data on a certain dashboard, and that dashboard automating that analysis for us to thereafter share it with our donors. So that brings down the level of analysis that she needs to do. Now, further, if we want to extend that, we are also now planning. We don't have it in house. In fact, Riverside does it. We'll have monthly data reviews. So now you, instead of you just reporting or even for in-house usage, plain data, the next level is how do you carve out insights from that data, which can be really granular at a student level. So for that, Riverside does something called monthly data reviews, where let's say if I am the teacher of grade 3, I may present all of my data to all the other teachers of the primary grades and the coordinator as well, and maybe other teachers based on need. But they give me feedback as to what I can improve, where do I think there is potential, and so on. Similarly, on the slightly on the academic front, but again, something that the teachers did was, there's a lot of lesson planning that they have to do, obviously, and these lesson plans don't end up changing year on year. Also, while the class group may change, your lessons don't change. Essentially, your way of delivering those lessons might change. So what we've done is we've used AI to create a lesson plan generator in house. Um, that lesson plan generator generates the exact duration of a period, which is 35 minutes in our school. 35-minute NEP aligned lesson plans in the format that we have in house, with the different elements of what activities will you do, with the different elements of exactly what will you ask students to do as homework, and so on. That's gotten down the workload of teachers, especially when they look at lesson planning. They are focused on which lesson to deliver when, and then the next step from there. Did the student understand that lesson or not, and who do I need to focus on for remedials?
Understood.
Uh,
Understood. One. I was just reflecting on this as you were speaking. Between the trainings, the once a year, twice a year things that happen, and these things which happen through the year. One common pattern that I'm noticing is that there is a sense of equality in how people are dealing with each other. It's
yeah.
not a hierarchical setup where the school owner or the principal is saying this is how it is, do it. Neither is it a free for all that everybody is doing whatever they want. There is
Yeah.
a dealing with each other as a group of genuine adults,
Yeah.
right? That let us come together and figure out how to work this out,
Yeah.
as opposed to I will instruct, you will do.
No, no, absolutely. Easier said than done, but yeah,
Yeah,
I
no, no, no.
think
That's for sure. But that's the pattern that I'm noticing of what these
yeah.
progressive schools are doing.
There's a lot of co-creation. If I had to kind of put it in one word, co-creation is the right word, which builds ownership. If you push it top down, it will not work.
Yeah, yeah. And co-creation is also in its true spirit.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
cannot come think through that this is the answer. I will just make a session out of it and then get everybody to agree.
I want that answer.
We spoke about the triangle with the parent, student, and teacher,
Yeah.
and what the school does for each of them. We have discussed two of them, teachers and students. Now, coming to the parents part,
Okay.
what do you see teachers and schools do with parents in general? First, let's understand what's the broad framework under which different schools operate, and then we can drill down on specific practices that schools are adopting to drive that.
Hmm. Got it. Let me start with a personal experience actually, and then I'll share what I've come across as best practices. This is unrelated to what I do. I had gone from for my niece's admission to a particular school. I'll not name the school, but here in NCR only. And my niece had shifted to Bangalore, and then she was coming back to Gurgaon essentially, and she required readmission in her previous school where she used to study. When we visited that school for readmission, the principal of that school was so strict and so kind of straightforward in saying कि हो ही नहीं पाएगा मतलब there was total lack of empathy in the way uh, let's say the conversation with me happened. And I mean, if the number of seats are dried up, you can have that data shared with us, which makes it very clear that it's not possible, and whenever seats will open up, admission can be tried. But none of that happened. It was a very straightforward, very strict. In fact, I would go on to say it was a rude conversation that happened without empathy. So that is something that I personally, let's say, as a parent, wouldn't like. And that brings me to what I've observed in a lot of schools. Um, while the overall philosophy behind parent dealings might vary from strict to very empathetic, one thing that has always stood out is the level of engagement that a school has had with the parent, and that's always been high. And it's not just through PTMs, it's through the year on multiple other fronts. So but this is also different for both I mean, not for profit, but for the public sector, private schools, as well as for the non-profit schools, which is what I represent here. So for private schools, I see a set of different things that they do with parents, which helps build that rapport and relationship, and trust with the parent, especially where the parent is also involved in what the child is going through. Number one, which is actually what Eklavya terms as brahmastra for them in setting themselves as a good exemplary institution, is home visits, where the class teacher, before the academic year begins, or let's say in the beginning few weeks of the academic year, will visit every child's home in the natural setting, not in a made up setting. So that's the communication to the parent also. Obviously, there might be a little bit of here and there, but typically, if let's say there's a dog also that is there in the house, that dog has to be there. If there's a maid, that maid has to be there. And so it's just to understand the natural setting from which a child may come, and that helps understand the context of the child. Just to give you an example, one of the schools said that a child after school hours used to constantly spend time at school playing, and went back home late. And so the parent was always complaining, that the school is not handling this well or whatever, or the child is always distracted and is playing at school or whatever. So the school that school, instead of going and telling the child that you should not play, went and understood the home environment of the child, and figured that the child stays in a 3-story building which is right on the road, and so there is no playing area that the child has. And so that is where that intent of spending more time on that ground, because that is all that the child has after school hours in terms of play, get. So having an understanding of the home environment through home visits is very critical, and I think some of these schools like Eklavya, Riverside, do that, and
Yeah, yeah. So
that's
I'd add
good.
one anecdote from my this one as well. Uh, so one of the kids, very sharp, very smart. So what would end up happening in the class is that kid would finish everything first and then just keep talking around and disturbing other people and so on.
Okay.
But it was not disruptive in the class. It's
Hmm.
not like he's fighting with somebody or so on, but he just
Hmm.
starts chit chatting everywhere because he ends up finishing early. Now I didn't know how to deal with it. Even if you give him a difficult thing, he will finish it and then he will start chit chatting. Uh, and during this one of the visits, I got to know that he looks up to his elder sister a lot, and
Hmm.
her class was exactly next door.
Oh.
So she could actually keep an eye on him like this. And there were moments when I had noticed that would happen and he would quickly keep quiet. But after I made the visit home, I was able to make the distinction of when
Hmm.
he does not do the chit chatting and when he does the chit chatting. It was
Hmm.
times when his sister was not looking at him. So that just that insight, that was my in the Eklavya terminology Brahmastra with this kid, where I would say, sit down, otherwise I'll tell your sister.
We do something around parent counseling and one-on-one parent conversations. So we have something called chai pe charcha with parents. That is what we've termed it, instead of coffee with Karan. So so we call parents in smaller groups to our school, and there's a very free flowing informal conversation that happens, and a dedicated teacher to do that. So student welfare officer, SWO, is what that officer does, and she looks at all of the parent concerns, parent point of views that parents may have. To add to that, we also have a community mobilizer, a teacher who does surveys. So she does all of the home visits, pseudo home visits, in one go, and that survey helps us a look at our eligibility criteria, which is below a certain income threshold. So it helps validate and verify that, but also gets an understanding of what the home environment may look like and what's the setup that children come from, instead of having to spend time there. Just doing a visit or a tour also helps. The other practice, I think, is especially around co-creation, like I mentioned earlier, which is around academic calendar planning. That happens. Beyond that, there's also a lot of so some schools have annual days. Riverside, very interestingly, didn't have an annual day. They had monthly or bi-monthly catch-ups with the parent on different fronts. So for example, 1 month would be celebrate the child, wherein every class teacher would make a short presentation on each student. Let's say a 4 5 slide presentation on what is the child's strengths, or what is the child doing well in the last month, for example. And that is also co-created with the child. The teacher asks the child ki aapko kya, what do you want to present, what do you want your parent to know, etc. Obviously there's a level of filtering that the teacher would do, but that's all in conversation with the child. And then the teacher presents that PPT to the parents in front of the child, and that's a very good moment for the child as well as for the parent. It kind of breaks down that, division of a there being a table in between the parent and the teacher.
Yeah, and it's
So
also a very positive environment for the child,
yeah,
where both important adults in their life, their
yeah.
parents and the teacher, are talking good things to the child.
It's not a PTM where
Ah,
you just look at improvement areas and you look at grades, but you look at the child holistically, and the focus is on strengths rather than weaknesses.
yeah, yeah. We have
Yeah.
spoken about how teachers are hired, what kind of support is given to them, how schools work with them, through them, with parents as well. Now, what is the career trajectory for a teacher that are happening in these progressive schools? How are they promoted? How are salaries decided? What's the growth that is offered to them, and so on?
That's an interesting question, because just first principles, when I was entering this space, I realized one of the things that I used to hear at my previous firm that I used to work with is that there's a clear growth trajectory for every consultant that joins the firm, uh, right? But when we look at the education space, I don't think there is a clear growth trajectory like you have it in the normal corporate, or let's say the startup space or whatever. So, when you join, there is a almost a 70-80% possibility of you just stagnating, or you rotating across different subjects and classes with some increment in your salary, etc. But and this is probably done better in colleges, because there are different designations that you go through, and there's some growth trajectory. For example, you're moving from an ad hoc professor to an assistant, then associate, and HOD, and so on. So there's a growth trajectory there. But in schools, I don't think this is done very well. Or in fact, even if schools, if they have something like this, it's not documented and communicated to teachers like it's a growth trajectory for them. So I think this is something that is missing. And so what is required is probably one thing that I personally thought should be there is that every teacher should know that there are clear designations through which you will go through in case you do well, and this happens appraisal after appraisal. Second, at some point in time you can choose between two tracks. You can either take a management track. If you're good with children, if you're good with people, you can take up a management track. For example, you can move from being a teacher to a coordinator, or from a coordinator to a principal or a vice principal or whatever. And there, if thereafter, if there are a chain of schools, then you can also look at multiple schools together. I mean, with a set of principals. On the other hand, if you're an individual contributor kind of a person who liked working with students but doesn't want to manage other teachers or the school at large with all of its administrative roles and responsibilities, then you can take up a more academic role with the curriculum or the innovations that are happening. So maybe part of the innovation cell or the R&D, and then look at overall curriculum across the entire school or schools and so on. And again, that can also be broken up by wing, where you have primary wing, innovation cell, middle, senior, and so on. So you can create those levels that incentivize teachers to do well, and that they know that they can grow even in the school setup. So that is one thing that I feel is missing right now. Having said that, even with the current structure that is there, um, I think the appraisal process that happens, um, in fact, one of the insights that we had at Own Foundation School, is that initially we, in our appraisal process, had academic marks as one of the criteria, and the weightage for that was a little high. Now, what we realized was that that weightage is leading to some misaligned behavior when you look at on ground impact. For example, the grading of a particular scorecard may be a little lenient, or for example, the kind of question papers that are getting set may have repetitive, similar, or easier questions, for example, so that children are able to score well and so on.
Yeah, yeah. The
So
classical
that,
Goddard's law. What you measure will start getting managed.
yeah, exactly. So that essentially defeated the purpose of learning, as well as being able to assess whether a teacher is doing well or not.
Yeah.
So we've changed that and reduced the weightage that you assign to grades.
Before we close, one common pattern that you're seeing, which is a gap in teachers
Hmm.
across the board, whether it's a progressive school, non-progressive, whatever, something that all teachers need to improve on.
I think there's a deeper realization that I've been having for a while now, which is that, and these are coming from two different, let's say, let me share two different insights, or rather pieces of information that lead to what I'm saying. Number one is that while understanding or doing research on children, I realize that children end up mimicking what they see around. Uh, so children are good imitators, and that is also what Waldorf talks about. That is what a lot of different philosophies talk about. So that children imitate. So you definitely need people that they can look up to and imitate. You need good people out there who they should imitate. Second is that teaching as a profession, um, I think, while keeping aside the other aspects of the ancient Indian system of varnas, uh, the teacher or the Brahman was kept at the top of the entire ladder. Now that's not there anymore. I mean, teaching as a profession is right at the bottom, where teachers are not given that level of respect by parents and by others, and it shows up in everything that's happening, whether it's salary, whether it's the kind of conversation that's happening within the school, outside the school, with parents and so on. Whether parents are asking their children to become educators or not is another way to look at it. And so, a, teachers not having that level of reputation. Second, children actually mimicking whoever they look at in front of them, requires teachers to be role models. um, Teachers have to essentially be role models because children are mimicking them, but teachers are not being role models because of the reputation that this profession commands today. Obviously there is a small segment of teachers that does this very well, but at large I see a lot of challenges in the way that the teacher is conducting themselves. They may be good competent wise, they may know everything well, uh, in fact they may also be managing themselves well, but if you just look at general conduct, whether there are basic values around, let's say, honesty, if you're asking the child to be honest, are you being honest yourself?
Yeah,
And children are very smart to figure that out. So helping or nurturing teachers to be good role models would, you know, solve for all the behavioral challenges that you see around in the current generation.
yeah. This just the previous conversation that I had, the episode that went out yesterday also. This principal spoke about schools need to be a demonstration of the world that we want to build in the future,
Yeah,
which means we have
yeah.
to live it today. कि हम, how much respectful we are, how much collaborative we are, how much care and love we show. Uh, that is the demonstration unit.